Mother, once the will is signed, this house, the company, all of it belongs to us. We will finally be free of her.
Mother, once the will is signed, this house, the cars, the company, all of it belongs to me. Belongs to us, Mom. We will finally be free of her. His mom interrupts, laughing. If you ever find yourself trusting the wrong person because they treated you kindly, you should watch this story until the very end. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Eleanor Whitfield built her furniture company from a single workshop into a name found in showrooms across 3 states. She was 52 years old, sharp with numbers, careful with people, and slow to trust anyone who wanted something from her. That caution disappeared the day she met Marcus Bellamy at a trade show in Charlotte, where he had come representing a lumber supplier and stayed an extra hour after his booth closed simply to hear her talk about grain patterns and joinery. He was gentle in a way that made her forget to be careful. He remembered how she took her coffee before she'd finished telling him. He asked about her late father's woodworking tools like they mattered to him too, and by the end of that first evening, Eleanor found herself wondering why she had waited so long to feel this comfortable with anyone. Within a year they were married in a small ceremony at her family's old lake house, and Eleanor believed, for the first time in a long while, that she had found someone who wanted her rather than what she had built. Marcus never once made her feel like her success was a threat to his pride. When a colleague joked at a company dinner that a man married to the boss must feel small, Marcus simply smiled and said he'd never once felt small standing beside something he was proud of. He handled the small tasks she never had time for, dropping off dry cleaning, remembering to renew the car registration, calling the accountant when she was buried in a project deadline. Eleanor's friends called him a rare find, and she believed them completely. He learned her late mother's birthday without being told and brought flowers to the cemetery every year without needing a reminder, standing beside her in silence the way only someone who understood grief could. On their 3rd anniversary, he filled the living room with candles and a small wrapped box containing a bracelet engraved with the date of their first conversation at the trade show, not their wedding day, because he said that was the moment that actually mattered to him. Eleanor cried that night, certain she had finally been given the steady, uncomplicated love she had stopped expecting to find. She kept that bracelet in a drawer for years afterward, unable to look at it directly, though she never once threw it away. His family folded into her life just as easily as he had. His mother, Ruth, called her daughter within months of the wedding and sent handwritten cards for every holiday, no matter how small. His younger brother, Owen, came to her with an idea for a bakery, spreading handwritten projections across her dining table with hands that shook slightly from nerves. And Eleanor spent 2 evenings going through the numbers with him, tightening the plan until it actually worked before agreeing to back it. Marcus's younger sister, Callie, was still finishing college, and Eleanor quietly covered what financial aid didn't, wanting nothing more than to see her graduate without the weight of debt following her into adulthood. When Marcus's father needed a hip replacement the hospital wouldn't schedule without a deposit, Eleanor paid it before Marcus finished asking, and his father squeezed her hand from the hospital bed afterward, calling her the daughter he'd always wanted. Every family gathering ended the same way, with someone raising a glass and saying, "Marcus, you married a rare woman. Treat her well, or you'll answer to all of us." And Marcus always laughed and agreed, pulling Eleanor close like the joke embarrassed him. She believed, watching those dinners unfold year after year, that she had built something rare and lasting. A marriage surrounded by a family that had accepted her completely rather than merely tolerated her for what she could provide. The only ache in an otherwise full life was the absence of a child. For years into the marriage, there was still no pregnancy, no matter how carefully Eleanor tracked, hoped, and quietly grieved each month that passed without one. She blamed her own body more times than she could count, sitting in fertility specialists' offices while Marcus held her hand and told her repeatedly that he wasn't in a hurry, that he only wanted her, that it would happen when it was meant to happen. She believed him, the way she believed everything he told her, because nothing in his behavior had ever given her reason not to. She didn't yet know that the absence of a child in her home was not bad luck at all, but a decision someone else had quietly made for her and continued making month after month without her ever suspecting it. Then, in the 5th year of the marriage, Marcus came to her one evening with a request. His cousin Diane needed somewhere to stay after a difficult breakup left her without a place to live, at least until she found her footing again. Eleanor agreed without hesitation, and Diane arrived 2 days later with a suitcase and a soft, grateful voice, calling her Ellie from the very first afternoon. Diane was helpful in the kitchen, generous with compliments, quick to notice when Eleanor came home tired, and have tea waiting without being asked. She remembered Eleanor's favorite shows, her allergies, the exact way she liked her toast, and within weeks the house felt fuller, and Eleanor, without quite noticing, had folded Diane into the same trust she extended to everyone in Marcus's family. Diane began joining Eleanor for small errands, admiring fabric swatches at the upholstery shop, asking careful questions about how the company had grown, listening with what looked like genuine fascination when Eleanor explained margins and supplier contracts. Once, when a supplier tried to renegotiate a contract at an unfavorable rate during a call Diane happened to overhear, Diane later mentioned, almost offhand, that she'd once studied a semester of business before dropping out, and offered a suggestion that turned out to be surprisingly useful. Eleanor found herself impressed, and began including Diane in small conversations about the business, never once suspecting that everything she shared was being carried straight back to Marcus and used to understand exactly how the company was structured and where its weaknesses might lie. Eleanor's closest friend, Patricia, met Diane at a dinner party that autumn and pulled Eleanor aside in the kitchen afterward, swirling wine in her glass with a look Eleanor had learned to take seriously over 20 years of friendship. "Something about that woman feels rehearsed," Patricia said quietly. "Too polished, too eager to be liked." Eleanor laughed it off, telling Patricia she was imagining things, that grief made people cling a little too tightly to kindness sometimes, and that Diane had been through enough without being judged for trying too hard to be liked. Patricia let it go that night, though she brought it up twice more over the following months, each time meeting the same gentle dismissal, until she eventually stopped mentioning it at all rather than risk the friendship over a feeling she couldn't prove. Then one night, unable to sleep, Eleanor came downstairs for water and heard low voices near the garage. Diane was speaking, asking how much longer they needed to keep giving her the tablets mixed into her evening vitamins, the ones designed to look like ordinary supplements while quietly wearing down her memory and her nerves until a diagnosis would explain everything on its own. Marcus answered that a few more months would be enough, that rushing it would draw attention from her doctors, and that once she showed clear enough signs of decline, they would have grounds to have her declared unfit to manage her own affairs. After that, he said, the company and the house could be transferred under a power of attorney his lawyer was already quietly preparing behind the scenes. Diane laughed quietly and said 6 months more of pretending to admire someone's furniture company was a small price for what came after. Marcus told her that once it was finished, they wouldn't have to hide anymore, that he was tired of introducing her as a cousin at every family dinner, tired of finding excuses to meet her in hotel rooms 2 towns over where no one would recognize either of them. Eleanor asked, voice flat only in her own mind, what would happen to her once the transfer went through, and heard Marcus tell Diane they would deal with that when the time came. Something in the ease of his voice telling her he had already decided the answer and simply hadn't said it aloud yet. Eleanor stood frozen in the hallway, absorbing every word like it belonged to someone else's life, someone else's marriage, someone else's family gathered around someone else's dinner table year after year raising glasses to a happiness that had never been real. She did not confront them that night. She walked back to bed, lay beside the man she had trusted completely, and understood with total clarity that revealing what she knew too soon would only make them careful, would only cost her the evidence she would need to protect everything she had spent 20 years building. Instead, she decided to let them believe they were winning, and to spend every quiet day that followed taking back what was hers before they realized she knew anything at all. The next morning, Marcus handed her the usual glass of vitamins with breakfast, kissing her forehead the way he always did, telling her she looked tired and should rest more. Eleanor thanked him, carried the glass to the bathroom, and poured it down the sink, just as she would every morning after, wrapping the tablets in tissue and hiding them inside a cosmetics bag at the back of her closet to keep as evidence rather than swallowing a single one. Her hands shook the first few times she did it, certain someone would notice the untouched residue or the sound of running water lasting a moment too long. But no one ever did, because no one in that house had ever once imagined she was capable of suspecting them. She brought the tablets to Dr. Patricia Alvarez, an internist who had treated her late mother for years and whom Eleanor trusted completely, sitting across from her in a private exam room with the tissue-wrapped pills resting on the desk between them like something radioactive. The lab results confirmed exactly what she feared, a compound that, taken daily over months, produced symptoms easily mistaken for early cognitive decline, memory lapses, disorientation, small tremors that would convince any doctor unfamiliar with the full picture. Dr. Alvarez asked what Eleanor intended to do, and Eleanor answered that she wanted them to believe they had succeeded, right up until the moment they discovered they hadn't, and Dr. Alvarez, after a long silence, agreed to help her document everything quietly. Eleanor's next call was to her attorney, a meticulous woman named Grace Okafor who had handled the company's legal affairs for a decade and had, on more than one occasion, warned Eleanor gently about keeping too much authority under a single household. Eleanor asked her to restructure the ownership of the business and the property into a protective trust that only the two of them could authorize, closing off any path a future power of attorney might reach. Grace worked quietly over 3 weeks, moving accounts, updating filings, and severing every legal thread Marcus's lawyer might later try to pull, meeting Eleanor only in the evenings at Grace's own home to avoid any chance of being seen together during business hours. By the time Grace confirmed the structure was complete, every document Marcus believed he was working toward had already become worthless, though he had no way of knowing that yet, and continued moving forward with a plan that had quietly collapsed weeks earlier without his awareness. To keep them convinced in the meantime, Eleanor consulted a specialist in cognitive rehabilitation, Dr. Samuel Reyes, who taught her, over several private sessions, how memory decline actually presents, the pauses before answering, the reaching for a word that wouldn't come, the small confusion over dates and names that would read as genuine rather than performed. He warned her that overacting would be as dangerous as not acting at all, that real decline looked frightened rather than dramatic, uncertain rather than theatrical. She practiced forgetting appointments she remembered perfectly. She practiced asking Marcus the same question twice in an hour, watching his face carefully each time to judge whether her performance was landing. She practiced crying over confusion that wasn't real, though by then there was enough real grief sitting beneath the performance that the tears came easily on their own, blurring the line between the woman she was pretending to be and the woman quietly grieving everything she had already lost. Dr. Reyes told her she was a fast study. Eleanor told him she had every reason to be, and asked him to keep detailed clinical notes on her true baseline health throughout, in case a court ever needed proof that none of it had been real. 6 weeks after that night by the garage, Eleanor began forgetting things in front of Marcus and Diane, small things at first, misplaced keys, a missed dinner reservation, a name she should have known without thinking. Marcus's concern, at first, looked almost real, and for one unguarded evening Eleanor allowed herself to wonder if some small part of him actually cared what was happening to her. He mentioned it to his mother on the phone, voice heavy with what sounded like worry, and told Eleanor gently that perhaps she should see a specialist, one he had already looked into, a doctor 2 counties over who Eleanor later learned had financial ties to a cousin of Ruth's, chosen specifically because his diagnoses tended to favor whoever was paying closest attention to the paperwork. Eleanor let herself be taken to that doctor, examined using tests subtly skewed to confirm exactly the decline Marcus expected, and delivered a diagnosis of early progressive memory loss that Marcus received with a solemn nod and, underneath it, something closer to relief than sorrow, a relief he thought he had hidden well enough that no one would notice. Eleanor noticed. She noticed the way his shoulders loosened in the parking lot afterward, the way he exhaled like a man who had just cleared a difficult hurdle rather than one who had just learned his wife was losing her mind. She said nothing, climbing into the passenger seat and thanking him quietly for taking care of her, watching him accept the gratitude without a flicker of guilt. The mask came off within weeks. Alone with her, Marcus stopped pretending patience. When Eleanor asked him to help her find a document she claimed she'd misplaced, he sighed and told her she needed to try harder to keep track of her own things, his voice carrying an edge she had never once heard directed at her in 5 years of marriage. Diane stopped bothering to lower her voice, telling Eleanor once, directly to her face, that she should be grateful anyone still bothered speaking to her at all, before catching herself and softening into a false, syrupy concern the moment Marcus walked back into the room, as though a switch had been flipped behind her eyes. One evening Eleanor heard them through the thin kitchen wall, Diane asking whether Eleanor could really not tell what was happening around her anymore, and Marcus answering that she was already halfway gone, that it hardly mattered what she overheard now, that soon none of it would matter at all. Eleanor sat with her tea going cold, memorizing every word, thinking of the small recorder Grace's investigator had helped her hide weeks earlier inside a decorative box on the mantel, capturing every syllable for a case file that was quietly growing thicker by the week, while the two people speaking so freely believed the only witness in the room was a woman too far gone to understand what she was hearing. Weeks later, Ruth called the house believing Eleanor was resting upstairs and out of earshot. Eleanor listened from the hallway as Ruth asked her son how much longer until everything was finally his, adding that she had always known Diane was the one meant for him, long before Eleanor had ever entered the picture, that she had prayed for this outcome quietly for years without ever once letting it show at family dinners. Marcus laughed and said it wouldn't be much longer at all, that Grace's paperwork was slow but the doctor's notes were building exactly the way they needed. Eleanor stood very still, understanding fully now that his entire family had known from the beginning, had accepted years of her generosity, while quietly waiting for the day it would all belong to someone else. She said nothing. She only lowered her head the way a tired, forgetful woman might, and let them believe she had heard nothing at all, carrying that particular conversation upstairs with her like a stone she would need to set down carefully later, in front of people who could actually do something about it. Owen visited twice during those months, and though he never said anything cruel to her directly, Eleanor noticed the way his eyes slid away from hers, the way his visits grew shorter, the way he stopped calling her for advice on the bakery's second location, as though he had quietly decided she no longer counted as someone worth consulting, only someone whose money had once been useful and would soon belong to someone else. And some nights Marcus and Diane ordered takeout and ate it at the dining table, while Eleanor sat across from them with an empty plate, the smell of the food filling the room. "Smells good, doesn't it?" Diane said once, not bothering to lower her voice. "Maybe if you're hungry enough you'll remember where the kitchen actually is." Eleanor said nothing, folding her hands in her lap and letting her eyes drift the way Dr. Reyes had taught her, unfocused, distant, giving them nothing to read except exactly what they already believed about her. Another evening, Diane dropped a pile of Marcus's laundry into Eleanor's lap and told her to wash it before dinner if she wanted to eat that night, and Eleanor felt her way to the laundry room with hands that shook from restraint rather than weakness, scrubbing shirts that belonged to a man who had once rubbed her feet after long days at the office without being asked. One night she heard them in the next room, only a few feet from where she sat pretending to watch nothing on the television, and then the unmistakable sound of them together, open and unhidden, as though her presence carried no more weight than a piece of furniture in the corner. "She can't even tell we're here," Marcus murmured, and Diane laughed low and said she felt a little bad about it anyway, and Marcus told her not to, that Eleanor was already halfway gone and wouldn't remember any of it by morning even if some part of her somehow understood. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her face blank behind the vague, unfocused expression she had practiced for months, her mind entirely clear and cataloging every second of it for whatever came next. Callie, now graduated and working in another city, called less and less, and when she did call, her voice carried a practiced cheerfulness that never quite reached the warmth it once had, as though she too had been given some version of the story and had chosen which side of it to believe. Eleanor understood, listening to those increasingly hollow phone calls, that gratitude built on money rarely survived the moment the money stopped serving someone's interests, and that every kindness she had extended to this family over the years had apparently been logged somewhere as a debt owed to Marcus rather than a gift given freely, one that would be forgiven the moment he no longer needed her goodwill to keep the household running smoothly. One evening, nearly caught, Eleanor stood at the bathroom sink pouring the evening dose away when Diane knocked softly on the door, asking if she was all right, saying she'd been in there a long time. Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs as she quickly wrapped the wet tissue and shoved it into her robe pocket, calling back that she was fine, just feeling unsteady. Diane offered to call Marcus, and Eleanor, forcing her voice into something soft and slightly lost, said there was no need, that she'd be out in a moment. Around that same time, Eleanor noticed the company's numbers behaving strangely, a shipment invoiced twice, a vendor payment routed through an account she didn't recognize, small enough that anyone else might have dismissed it as clerical error. She brought it quietly to Grace rather than to Marcus, and together they traced it back to a shell account Marcus had opened 8 months earlier, one that had already siphoned a modest but steady stream of company funds meant to establish a financial cushion for whatever came after the transfer went through. It was, Grace told her, additional evidence of premeditation stretching back further than either of them had initially realized, further proof for a case that was already becoming difficult for any defense attorney to argue against convincingly. One afternoon, Marcus brought her a folder of transfer documents, guiding her hand toward the signature line with the patient voice he once used when he genuinely loved her, the same voice from the trade show all those years ago, worn thin now, like fabric stretched past its use. Eleanor let her signature land wrong 3 separate times, once crossing an unrelated paragraph, once smearing across the company's name entirely, watching his composure thin with each failed attempt, his jaw tightening in a way she had never once seen directed at her before Diane arrived in the house. He never knew that weeks earlier, Grace had already finished securing everything beyond his reach, and that every signature he was chasing belonged to documents with no power left in them at all. He was fighting, without realizing it, for control of something he had already lost completely, and every frustrated sigh he gave her only confirmed how badly he wanted a company that could no longer be taken from her by paper alone. "Are you even trying?" he asked once, voice sharp enough that Diane glanced over from the kitchen doorway, and Eleanor answered softly that she really couldn't see the lines properly anymore, watching him exhale and gather the papers, promising they would try again tomorrow, unaware that tomorrow, and the day after, and every day for the next month would end exactly the same way. Each failed attempt buying Eleanor more time to finish building the case that would eventually end everything he had spent years quietly constructing. The final piece came from a private investigator Grace had quietly hired, who installed a small recording device inside the home office weeks earlier with Eleanor's permission, capturing conversation after conversation Marcus and Diane assumed no one would ever hear, discussions of which properties to sell first, which countries had weak extradition agreements, how long they would need to wait after the transfer before it looked natural for Eleanor's health to decline further and finally resolve itself entirely. Eleanor listened to those recordings alone in Grace's office one evening, hearing her own husband discuss the eventual end of her life in the same tone he might use to plan a vacation, and sat with that knowledge quietly for a long time before she trusted herself to speak again. On a Tuesday evening in early spring, nearly 8 months after the night by the garage, Eleanor walked into the living room without the confused expression she had practiced for months, sat down across from both of them, and told them plainly that she had heard everything since that very first conversation. Marcus went pale. Diane's hands began to shake, her mouth opening and closing without finding words. Eleanor told them there was nothing left in the house, the accounts, or the company for either of them to fight over anymore, that every document Marcus had spent months trying to force her to sign had been worthless from the beginning, and that everything they said next would be better spent explaining themselves to the police rather than to her. Marcus admitted it slowly, that he and Diane had loved each other years before he met Eleanor, that her family's disapproval and Diane's lack of money had once separated them completely, And that meeting Eleanor at that trade show had looked, at the time, like the answer to every problem standing between them. Some of it, he said, had become real along the way. The years, the routines, some part of him had actually meant. Eleanor told him that loving what she owned was not the same as loving her, and that a man who truly loved her would never have quietly planned to declare her unfit while she was still healthy enough to fight for herself, would never have discussed the eventual end of her life like a line item on a spreadsheet. Diane cried and said she had only done what Marcus asked, that she had never wanted anyone to actually get hurt, only for things to finally work out the way they should have years ago. Eleanor told her that excuse would matter far more to a judge than it ever would to her, and asked one final question before the police arrived, whether Diane had ever actually been Marcus's cousin at all. Owen and Callie were never charged, having played no direct role in the plan itself, though both later admitted under questioning that they had suspected something was wrong for months and chosen silence rather than risk their place in a family that had clearly already decided which side they needed to be on. Eleanor learned this without much surprise, having already understood, somewhere in those long, quiet months of pretending, that loyalty in that family had always run toward whoever controlled the money rather than toward whoever had earned it, and that she had simply been too willing, for too many years, to mistake convenience for genuine affection freely given. Months later in court, the prosecutor walked the jury through the timeline in careful detail, the tablets, the lab confirmations, the forged medical assessments, the recordings that left no real argument for the defense to make. Dr. Alvarez explained the chain of custody behind every sample with clinical precision, while Dr. Reyes described, in plain terms the jury could follow, exactly how Eleanor's performance of decline had been built and monitored against her real, unwavering health throughout. A forensic accountant testified for nearly 2 hours about the shell account, walking the jury through wire transfers and dates that lined up, month after month, with entries in Marcus's own calendar, entries labeled only with initials, but timed precisely around each visit to the compromised doctor. The defense attorney tried, briefly, to suggest the account belonged to a legitimate side venture Marcus had never disclosed to his wife, but the timeline collapsed under cross-examination once the prosecutor produced a message between Marcus and Diane discussing exactly how much they'd need once the company was theirs. The defense had no answer for any of it. When the recordings played aloud in the courtroom, Marcus's voice describing his wife as already halfway gone filled the room, and several people in the gallery gasped audibly, while Marcus himself stared at the floor and never once looked up. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, she stood at the front of the courtroom, calm in a way that surprised even her, and told them plainly that she wasn't there for revenge, only to make certain she wasn't remembered as a woman who simply let herself become a victim in her own story. She said she had let them believe they had already won, and used every quiet day that followed to make sure they hadn't, that she had spent 8 months pretending to lose herself so that she could finally prove exactly how much of herself she had left. The jury took less than a day to reach a verdict, and the sentences that followed were long enough to make the shame Ruth carried afterward outlast whatever money she had once hoped her son would gain. Outside the courthouse, reporters who had caught fragments of the story from court staff gathered at the base of the steps, calling out questions Eleanor had no intention of answering in detail. One asked whether she had anything to say to other women watching the case unfold on the local news that evening. Eleanor paused at the top of the steps, Grace beside her, and said only this: "Don't ever assume a quiet woman has nothing left to fight with. And don't ever mistake someone's patience for weakness simply because she hasn't shown you what she's capable of yet." She walked down the steps without waiting for another question, leaving the reporters to fill in the rest of the story however they chose. The house was quiet in the weeks that followed the trial. Patricia came by almost every day, cooking real meals again, sitting with Eleanor on the same sofa where Marcus used to bring her coffee every morning without being asked. "How are you feeling?" Patricia asked one afternoon, and Eleanor told her lighter, like she had finally put down something she'd been carrying for the better part of a year. "You did something incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous," Patricia said, and Eleanor agreed, but added that she couldn't have lived with herself another way, couldn't have simply signed whatever they put in front of her and disappeared quietly into whatever ending they had already decided to write for her. Dr. Alvarez visited too, no longer as a doctor keeping careful secrets, but as a friend checking in on someone she had come to genuinely admire over the course of the ordeal. "How are you feeling?" she asked, echoing Patricia's question almost exactly. "Lighter," Eleanor said again, and meant it a little more each time she said it aloud to someone new. Grace stopped by occasionally as well, updating her on Owen's bakery, which Eleanor had quietly transferred full ownership to him once the trial concluded, deciding his years of honest effort deserved to outlast his family's betrayal, even if she never spoke to him again beyond the paperwork required to make the transfer official and complete. Owen reached out once, nearly a year after the sentencing, asking if he could speak with her in person rather than through Grace's office. Eleanor agreed, meeting him at a coffee shop far from anywhere either of them used to frequent, and listened as he told her he had suspected something was wrong for months before the arrests, had noticed Diane's stories shifting slightly each time she told them, had noticed his mother's phone calls growing hushed whenever he walked into a room, and had chosen, out of fear and cowardice he was still ashamed of, to say nothing rather than risk being wrong about his own brother. Eleanor listened without interrupting, and told him, when he finished, that she appreciated the honesty more than he probably realized, though it didn't change what his silence had cost her in those final months. She told him the bakery was fully his now regardless of anything else between them, that his hard work over the years had earned it honestly, separate from whatever debt the rest of his family thought they owed her. Owen thanked her, eyes wet, and said he understood if she never wanted to see him again, that he wasn't asking for forgiveness, only for her to know that not everyone in that house had known everything, even if he'd known enough to feel complicit in his silence. Eleanor told him she believed him, and that belief, small as it was, felt like the first honest exchange she'd had with anyone from that family in over a year. They didn't become close again, not the way they once were, but she no longer crossed the street to avoid him when their paths occasionally crossed in the years that followed. Eleanor sold the house within the year, unable to walk past the garage without remembering the voices she'd overheard there on an ordinary night that changed everything that came after. She kept the company, rebuilding its reputation slowly with Grace's help, hiring new leadership she trusted completely, and stepping back from daily operations for the first time in over a decade to give herself room to simply exist without proving anything to anyone. She thought, more than once, of the bracelet still sitting in a drawer somewhere among her packed belongings, engraved with a date from a trade show in Charlotte that had once meant everything and now meant almost nothing at all, though she still couldn't quite bring herself to throw it away. A year after the trial, Eleanor stood on the balcony of a new house in a different part of the state, watching the sun go down over rooftops she didn't recognize yet but was slowly learning to call home. Patricia visited that evening, the same friend who had once quietly warned her about Diane at a dinner party years before anyone else had noticed anything wrong. "Do you ever regret it?" Patricia asked, and Eleanor thought about it for a long moment before answering that she regretted trusting too quickly in the beginning, but never once regretted how she ended it, that she had given herself the ending she deserved instead of the one they had spent months trying to write for her. Patricia smiled and squeezed her hand, telling her she wasn't the same woman who used to pour vitamins down a bathroom sink in secret, terrified of being caught. No, Eleanor agreed, that woman was gone. What was left was someone who finally understood exactly what she was capable of surviving, and exactly what she was no longer willing to accept simply because it arrived wrapped in kindness. Dr. Reyes called that same evening, having heard through Grace that the anniversary had passed without incident, and asked how it felt, a year later, to finally be on the other side of it. Eleanor stepped further out onto the balcony, phone pressed to her ear, and told him she finally felt like she was writing her own story, not the one someone else had planned for her from the very beginning. Somewhere across the state, in a cell he would spend a long time inside, Marcus sat with nothing left of the life he had tried to quietly take for himself. Somewhere else, Diane counted the years still ahead of her own sentence, wondering, perhaps, whether any part of what she'd felt for Marcus over the years had ever been worth what it eventually cost her. Somewhere further still, Ruth lived out her remaining years carrying the particular shame of a mother who had encouraged her son towards something this cruel, a shame that followed her long after her own sentence ended and she returned, quietly and without ceremony, to a life no family gathering would ever again gather around the same way. None of that concerned Eleanor any longer. She had already spent enough of herself on their version of her story, enough quiet months performing a decline she never actually suffered, enough years extending trust to people who had only ever seen her as a means to an end. She turned from the balcony that evening, walked back inside her new home, and closed the door softly behind her, not because she needed to keep anything out any longer, but because for the first time in longer than she could remember, there was nothing left she needed to guard herself against, and nowhere left she needed to perform for anyone but herself.